Hello everyone, this is Mr. Aguilar. Today's Tuesday the 13th. I'm posting this video later tonight or early Wednesday. So I want to go over a couple of things today. One, I want to make sure that we understand what's due this week, week 5. So if you look at the week 5 folder, you'll see that there is a discussion due uh, Wednesday by 11:59 to answer these two questions. They are on the two lectures that I posted here from Angela Davis. It was a lot of reading, so I'm going to try to supplement that reading today in lecture. So I'm going to be going over some of my notes and try to sort of bridge any gaps or sort of address any points of confusion that you might have. And then I'm going to go over some of the instructions that I have for week 6, as well as what I have planned for week 7. So I'm going to go over the cultural analysis essay, but this will all be towards the end of the video. So if you want to skip to that, you may. And there's also a couple more instructions before I'm going to go to the cultural analysis for week 6. The week 6 folder is not up yet, but as soon as this video is uploaded, it should be up. And you can find, again, all the course materials you need are here under course materials. Right here, everything's divided in weekly folders. You'll notice right now week 6 is not available yet. I haven't made it available. As soon as it does, or as soon as I do make it available, I'll send out an announcement with a course link to it. Okay, so for now, let's get into the week 5 material. You were supposed to have read both of Angela Davis's lectures on liberation. Now, if you don't know who Angela Davis is, I have both of these lectures actually come from this book. I don't know if you can see it, but they both come from this book. It's The Narrative Life of Frederick Douglass, and I had you guys read one section from Frederick Douglass last week from Learning to Read and Write. But that was actually chapter 7 from the book. And Angela Davis references different chapters throughout the book as she goes through her lecture, because she is really talking about this one work. And I really want to read one paragraph uh, from from this edition. It's written by, or at least the introduction was written by Rey Rugorio. Um, he's a very famous musician, painter, artist from New York, and in that area, and he discovered sort of Angela Davis's work and decided to put it all together in book form, and so it is here. But he makes a really great, I think, or adds some context to who Angela Davis was in this page. So I'm going to read to you this one paragraph, and maybe this will give you some context about who Angela Davis was. He says, Angela Davis was a young multilingual scholar who had graduated magna cum laude from Brandeis University, and while studying under Herbert Marcuse to earn her doctorate, she had accepted a 2-year teaching appointment in the philosophy department at the University of California in Los Angeles, UCLA. On July 1st, 1969, William T. DeVale, an undercover agent of the FBI, published a statement in the Daily Bruin that the UCLA philosophy department has just hired an assistant professor who was a communist. And on July 9th, 8 days later, the San Francisco Examiner identified the professor to be Angela Y. Davis. Richard Nixon was president, Ronald Reagan was governor of California, and when the news reached the university's Board of Regents, they fired Davis before the semester had begun. Her termination sparked considerable controversy, protest, and national media coverage. With a groundswell of grassroots support, Davis fought back. In an act of resistance, she showed up for the first day of her course called Recurring Philosophical Themes in Black Literature. Expecting to deliver a lecture to the 166 students who had enrolled in the class, she instead found more than 1,500 members of the UCLA student body and faculty assembled in a show of support. The lecture she delivered that day is one of 2 talks about Frederick Douglass in the pamphlet and is presented here in book form for the first time. So he goes on to give some more details about some of the research that she does and did. But I want you to sort of appreciate, what kind of work we're reading here. So her first lecture is the only one that she actually delivers in person. The second one is what she printed out for the pamphlet that they would sell for 50 cents and try to help her with legal fees as she was trying to be released from jail. Excuse me. And so at the time, you have to understand that it was very controversial uh, to be a communist, but what was worse is the fact that she was a young black woman teaching in a philosophy department, in sort of protest, she shows up for the first class anyway, decides to deliver the lecture, um, and really the lecture serves two purposes, right? One is to show that I can still teach the course. Just because I have my own political leanings doesn't mean I can't teach. And two, it also, is a protest against her own wrongful uh, incarceration. So as you read it, I hope that you understand that there are several sort of elements that we ought to be considering as she's going through this. Now, if you haven't been exposed to philosophical writing before, this text may have been challenging. I know the first time I read anything in philosophy, and the first one I ever read um, was Plato and then Aristotle. And then after that, I read Hegel, Kant, Heidegger, um, Jean-Paul Sartre, Nietzsche. I read all of these philosophical texts, but it was so difficult getting into them um, because the structure was unfamiliar to me. It didn't sound like a normal essay, the way most people write essays or arguments. So one thing you should know about the philosophical tradition is that more often than not, we start with several definitions that we're trying to um, make sure everyone is clear on. And she does that really at the beginning of the first lecture when she talks about what it means to be a slave. She asks this really pivotal question: is man free or is he not? Ought he be free or ought not he be free? And she, of course, thinks that black literature is the best example of how we can really look at this dilemma of what freedom really means. And one of the things that that she does throughout this lecture is that she's trying to answer another pivotal question here. She says, "Is freedom?" This is on the bottom of page 47. "Is freedom totally subjective, totally objective, or is it a synthesis of both poles?" And she goes on to explain a little bit more, but essentially what she's trying to say, and she kind of gets to it on the top of page 48, is freedom the freedom of thought or the freedom of action? Or more important, is it possible to conceive of the one without the other? And so she's going to try to answer this question specifically with the aid of Frederick Douglass's narrative. Again, you read a chapter from it, and she does actually use that chapter quite a bit because in it it reveals sort of the means by which someone can achieve a level of freedom. So as she goes through it, she's sort of trying to answer one question at a time and leaving some things unanswered, which is not typical. Most philosophical texts try to answer everything in a dialectical manner, and what that means is essentially that you and the other person are going back and forth, sort of like the Socratic method of I ask a question, you give me an answer, I ask a question in response to be more specific until finally we've reached a point where either we can both agree on some definition or we realize where our differences lie and we can then at least identify the point of contention. And so this is key in philosophy, and she's doing this, again, she's trying to cram a lot of this information within an hour's worth of a lecture. Um, she eventually, of course, arrives at certain points, right? One pivotal difference, and I think she arrives in page 48, is that the slave is free in the sense that he can choose between his state of captivity and his death, right? And she, of course, thinks about this in terms of like, well, if you're a slave and you have chains on you, you can still choose to end your life, right? But that's the contradiction here, right? If you are a slave and you can still break free, isn't that impossible? If you're a slave, that means you have no free will, you have no thought. It can't be possible for you to also choose to die. You have no choice. So that seems to be a contradiction. But she also says that, well, It's, throughout our history, we've had arguments for why we do have slaves, and one of the philosophical arguments is that, well, slaves are less than human, or they're not quite human, they are subhuman. And of course, she says, well, let's think about what that means. We'd have to have a whole different species, and we have to think that for a slave to really be subhuman, that means they wouldn't be capable of freedom. But that's not true, right? We see over and over again that lots of people who were slaves eventually tried to win their freedom. So it doesn't seem likely that that's the answer. So then the answer we must arrive at is that there is some contradictory nature to slavery. Slavery is not possible. And she kind of says it here, right? That either the slave is not a man or his very existence is a contradiction. And she explores that idea by looking specifically at Frederick Douglass, right? And this contradiction manifests itself in a sense of what she calls non-identity. This idea that, like, if being a person entails being free at the same time, right? If we are human beings, we should certainly be free, just because we are human beings. Well, then it begs the question that what happens when a human being is enslaved? What is happening to that person's freedom if they are inherently free? If that's just a normal characteristic of a human being, what happens to their sense of identity? And she explores that, and she says essentially that the key, of course, is alienation. The idea that the only way for us to realize how a slave must feel is that at some level they feel alienated. And she talks about this in the top of page 53, that it is a removal, or in other words, she calls it an absence of authentic identity. He is alienated, and again, she's talking about slaves here, from his own freedom. The idea is that within us we have freedom, but to become a slave means to push that freedom away, essentially creating a fracture or a rift or a fissure within a person, and then they become no one, right? And again, she talks about what that looks like in a slave, right? On one level, it could happen unconsciously, as she puts it here, right? Say that the slave is not aware that they are capable of freedom, or that they can be free, which means then it's like, well, I'm not my slave, I must not be free, I guess I'll never be free, right? And it's sort of unconscious, we just believe it. Or it can be conscious, as it was in Frederick Douglass's case, where he was aware that he could be free and he ought to be free, but he was still a slave in legal terms, or technically he was still a slave. And that's, I suppose, was such an important realization for him, because he didn't have to be a slave all his life if he didn't wish it. And there's this wonderful quote, if I can find it. Let's see. Talks about being virtually a free man, even though he's legally a slave. I may have skipped it. Yeah, I must have skipped it. It's hard to find some of these quotes only because of the pagination. I can't search this document for exact quotes. Oh, that's a shame. Well, he goes on anyway to say that as soon as you become aware of your own possibility of being free, then technically you can't be a slave anymore. It is impossible to be a slave because you are aware. And having awareness goes completely against what it means to be a slave. And this is important. Here it is. It's in the middle of page 52. He said that slave who had the courage to stand up for himself against the overseer, although he might have hard stripes at first, became, while legally a slave, virtually a free man. And of course, this is the next point she makes, or sort of backtracking here. The next point she makes is about resistance, that freedom can be achieved through resistance, whether it's physical resistance, violent resistance, or slow, sort of steady resistance against someone. You can achieve freedom. In his case, he happened to find freedom through knowledge, that awareness, that conscious knowing that you ought not to be a slave. I'm sorry. So this is, key here too. Uh, we have to be aware that we are alienated, and the only way we can do that is through knowledge. And that knowledge, of course, uh, reveals in Frederick Douglass's agony, this depression, this awful condition of wanting to be a beast and being, jealous of his own fellow slaves for their ignorance, which of course you read in in chapter 7. And I suppose the bigger point here is that even if we did attain freedom at some level, as Douglass did, right, it's still not enough to be free. Because as long as the institution of slavery exists, slavery can always come back. And she says here, and not even then, for there will remain remnants, and there still remain in existence today the causes that gave rise to slavery. And of course, that's unfortunate, right? The reality is there's always going to be this potential for slavery. And since there was always the first slave, and as long as there was one slave, there's a possibility for more. Um, and she goes on, of course, to say and talks a little bit about religion and what role it played for slaves, and what role it played for the white slave owners, and how religion can actually have two purposes. She talks about this to some length, not just here, but also she continues in the second lecture about religion, and how it um, could have had a positive effect, but equally a detrimental or negative effect. But the bigger point I really want to skip to is this idea of why it's impossible for a slave to even be a slave. And more importantly, how we know that impossibility is at work in real terms. There is this idea of a slave breaker. A slave breaker was someone that came in, lived on a plantation, and when a slave rebelled, which automatically that should give out the sign, right? If a slave can't rebel, a true slave cannot rebel because they are a slave to their master's will. But in this case, that was possible. So that must mean then that you had to bring someone in to torture that slave, so that when they rebelled, all of that would be quelled immediately. So she goes on to this discussion about, well, what does it mean to be, or what do we mean by this idea of slave breaker? He's the one designated to tame impudent slaves who refuse to accept for themselves the definition that society has imposed upon them. He must destroy the human being in the slave before it succeeds in upsetting the whole balance present in the system of slavery. His instrument is violence. He does violence to the body in order to break the will. Okay, so and this is important because we're going to see that the slave breaker is not just this instrument of violence and horror. It's the fact that even his existence doesn't make sense, for reasons I've just stated, but more importantly because the slave breaker must be a slave too. In order to commit that violence, you have to be less than human too. A human could not do that to another human. We do commit atrocities to other people when we feel that we've been wronged or we feel like we want revenge. But just for the sake of keeping someone enslaved, that seems inhuman. So we have to, as she puts here, the question we must ask ourselves is whether he can perform that task without mutilating his own humanity. We ought to be able to infer from the answer to this question what happened to the humanity of the white man in general during the era of slavery. And again, it does seem that at some point we have to ask ourselves, where does the authority come from for the slave owner? And she goes into this a little bit more in depth, and I think it's worth looking into on your own when you have a chance. But the key here was that when Frederick Douglass does eventually resist Mr. Covey physically, when he tries to push him back and hit him, Mr. Covey immediately asks for help. Not from someone else around him, but more specifically from slaves that were nearby. And of course, nobody moved. And Mr. Covey, was huffing and puffing. He was panicking. But that doesn't seem possible. If this authority, if this power was truly his, he would be able to exercise that power on anybody. But that's not the case. It means that at some point, the slaves have to be able to give over consent, even if it is forced consent, to the white man. And only with that forced consent is that power actually given. It's the same reason why in the Catholic Church system, the person who has the most power in the Catholic Church is not the Pope, it is the priest. The priest is the one that we, as followers of Catholic Church, have to give over our confessions, have to be willing to speak to have that person pray on our behalf. He is the one who's responsible for absolving sins and so on. So we have no direct contact to the Pope. In fact, it's unlikely that priest has direct contact to the Pope. But that seems to be where the most interaction happens and where that power is being given over. So too in the case of slavery. Slaves, not willingly, but gave over their power to this person out of fear and intimidation. And as soon as that power was asked for back, as soon as we resisted and took that power back, that person is powerless, has no more power than anyone else. And that is how, quite literally, Frederick Douglass achieved his freedom. So that is essentially a very quick but comprehensive breakdown of the two lectures. I still insist that you go and read them on your own to get some more ideas about clarity on certain issues like, how exactly does she prove this, or what passages does she use to support her argument. But generally, that's essentially the main takeaways from the reading. All right, now let me talk really quickly about the week 5 discussion. So this is due tomorrow, but by the time you're watching this video, it's probably due this evening. You're going to answer 2 questions about the reading. One, I want you to tell me who is more enslaved. Is it the master or the slave? And of course, explain your reasoning. Number 2, in the second lecture, Davis alludes to Socrates, and she quotes, the raison d'être, which is the reason of existence, or the reason for philosophy, is to teach us proper living. Okay. Now, what life lessons are taught through these lectures? What takeaways can we take from these lectures that we can apply to our lives? Okay. And again, it's just standard. You post to these questions by Wednesday night, and then you have until Saturday to respond to 3 posts. Okay. All right. So for next week, for week 6, there's a couple of things I want you to look at. I'm going to go ahead and open up the course materials and go to week 6. Again, this is not up yet, but it will be up later tonight or tomorrow night. But there are some instructions I want you to be aware of. We've looked at freedom and oppression in terms of race so far, but we are about to turn our attention to sex, gender, and sexuality, starting with a cultural analysis essay due in week 7. For this week, week 6, next week, you will reflect on the semester thus far by posting a short video reflection to the week 6 discussion board forum. And I left some instructions here. If you click on those instructions, it's kind of a big file because I added images to help you with the instructions. Okay. Here we go. So I'm asking you to post a video. Now, if you've never posted a video before, and when I started teaching online, it was one of the first things I did. I don't normally post videos in my personal life, so it was strange doing it professionally. But I think the simplest way, and I want to make sure everyone does it the same way, is to do it through YouTube. And then ideally you would take your YouTube link that's created when you upload a video and put it into Blackboard. But these instructions should help clarify that. To have a YouTube account, you need a Gmail account first, since they're linked. So I have instructions here for how to create a Gmail account, and I added pictures here so that you were able to do it. But once you create a Gmail account successfully, then you can just sign into YouTube with that Gmail account, and be able to start creating videos immediately. Um, but to create a video, that's going to be the problem that I think some of you might run into, because it does require that you need to have either your smartphone. Uh, I have an iPhone, and I don't normally record videos on my iPhone, but I recorded a 10-second video yesterday, um, and because I have the YouTube app on my phone, I was able to just automatically upload that video straight to my YouTube channel as soon as I created one. Uh, if you are more comfortable using your phone, that's fine. I don't have a preference. I prefer to use my laptop, but I realize not everyone has a laptop and not everyone has a webcam or a good mic on their laptop. So if that's not possible, your phone should be just fine. And if you run into any problems, again, I insist that you email me immediately so that we can try to figure out how we can deal with that. So the instructions here for the video reflection is pretty simple. I want you to create and upload a short 2-minute video. It doesn't have to be long, but I want you to reflect on what you've learned in the semester so far. And the question essentially is going to be, how has this course impacted you? It could be in terms of your other classes, or perhaps your understanding of specific issues regarding race, or maybe you think there has been some application to your personal life. Whatever the case may be, and whatever you feel comfortable sharing with your classmates, that's what you're welcome to say in this 2-minute video. And again, you're going to upload your video to YouTube first, and then you're going to share that link into discussion board post, so that when you post a discussion board, all that we're going to see is the title of your post and the YouTube link. Because it's not possible to load, at least with Blackboard, a 2-minute video directly to discussion board. It's just too big of a file. So that's why it's just much easier to create a link offsite that we can go to that way. Again, if you run into any problems, you can contact me by email, text, or phone, and text would be quicker, just because I have my phone on me all the time, and sometimes my phone is set to refresh every 15 minutes for emails, but texts are instant. So you can text me. If you don't know what my number is, you can check in the syllabus. You'll notice, though, that your post isn't due until Saturday. So you have more than a week to get this one done. This time around, you don't have to reply to other people, although I do encourage you to still reply, because it's, of course, helpful to see that you guys interact with each other. But really, I know this might be a lot of work for some of you, so I'm trying to be realistic and give you guys more time to post your video and try to get everything set up. And that way, in case you do run into problems, you can always ask me and I'll be happy to help you. There will be another integrity lecture, although it'll be really short. But besides just doing this discussion, there is a small other thing I'm asking you guys to do. I want you to send me an email. Again, it has to be from a UTRGV account. I've had several people try emailing me from a Gmail account or Yahoo account, and I can't reply because all university related exchanges or messages need to be on our server side. If we don't, we risk sharing that information. So things like grades or other sort of sensitive information covered under FERPA, which is the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. By legally, I cannot exchange any information on another account. Some of you, I think I had a chance to at least tell you, because I had some people email me, and I just replied with, I can't discuss anything, contact me from your UTRGV account. So I'm just going to say it blanket to everyone, make sure you email me from your UTRGV account, okay? But I want you, again, to send me an email that updates me on your progress in the class. I sent out emails to several of you already, because I got some alerts through Blackboard saying, so-and-so hasn't logged in so many days, or so-and-so hasn't done the last 2 assignments, or so-and-so has a really low grade. Some of you, I've already contacted those of you who I think are in danger and need to check in with me. But I still insist that you kind of, I want you to tell me if there are any issues you've come across, any problems that need to be addressed, or any improvements that I can make for you. But in the subject line of the email, go ahead and tell me, English 1305 online, your name, and then say something like status update. And again, I want you also, you can use this opportunity to try to, talk to me about how you did in the summary response essay, and I can give you clarification of the grade. Or if you would like help with the cultural analysis essay, this would be a good time to do that too. Speaking of the cultural analysis essay, that's going to be in week 7, but I've already put the instructions in week 5, and I'll go ahead and copy over the instructions again to week 6. But here are the instructions. Again, it's due Sunday, February 25th. That would be the Sunday. Let's see. Did I get that right? Let's see, week 6. Yes, that would be Saturday the 24th. So it would be the Saturday before. Let's see. Yeah, so the Saturday, the 24th, would be when you need to post your video reflection. And the 25th would be when you need to turn in your cultural analysis. So the very next day. But you got plenty of time to do it. And this is not a hard assignment. I think it's very simple and easy, and it's going to be a lot of fun. It's going to be between 600 and 800 words, the same as a summary response essay. But this time you're going to answer the question, if you woke up tomorrow as the opposite sex, how would your life change? And I don't want you to just focus on the sex part. Because there's 3 categories that we got to consider. One is sex, the other is gender, and the last is sexuality. Sex has to do with the difference between male and female, right? It's a very biological or anatomical difference that can be identified by genitalia and so on. That's not complicated. But if you really want to talk about how your life would change, like, well, I'm going to have to pee standing up or sitting down, like, that's minor, and if you really want to talk about that, that's fine, but that's not really deep. And that's not what I'm concerned with. But I would be concerned with things like gender and sexuality, and here's the difference. Gender has to deal with the difference between man and woman, not male and female. So what makes a man a man? What makes a woman a woman? So if you're a man, what does it mean? What sort of performances or behavior do you have to do differently to be treated like a woman? And if you're a woman, what changes in your behavior or outlook do you need to do to change into a man? Now, sexuality is even beyond that. It's more about things like which sort of preferences you have sexually. Things like if you go for other men, or if you go for other women, or both, or neither, or whatever your sexual preferences are. You could talk about that in terms of your new gender, and how you would go about treating people of the opposite sex now that you're in the new gender. Essentially, how would you treat yourself if you were that gender? But you don't have to. That's a little bit more complicated, and we have a lot to talk about in terms of sexuality as the semester goes on. But I think the important thing to consider is gender, right? I have instructions more specifically here that you can read through, but essentially, it's no different than the summary response essay in terms of my expectations. Now, I have a little note here that says, keep in mind that this is a formal essay, not a narrative. So I don't want a story. Like, I woke up in the morning and I found this. Like, no. Just organize your thoughts into well-constructed paragraphs that clearly convey your meaning. In other words, if you know how you're going to change, well, tell me how you know you're going to change in your thesis, and then each paragraph will sort of tackle the reasons for that change or the different aspects of that change. And you'll, of course, talk about it objectively as much as possible. Okay? All right, well, if you don't have, and again, if you do have questions, feel free to contact me. I'll be happy to explain all of this a little bit more in detail. But again, so just to recap, you have discussion board due this week. Next week, you'll have an email to send me, and where I can give you updates and we can conference about what needs to be improved. And you'll also have a short video assignment to do for that week. In the meantime, as this is all going on, I encourage you to, of course, keep working on the cultural analysis essay, which is due in week 7. Next week, I'm not sure if I'm going to do a integrity video. I'm still not sure what the video would be on. I might just do a recap on what we've covered. But there is no midterm, and we're not quite at midterms yet, but we are about halfway through the coursework. So we've already covered race. We are going to cover a little bit about gender and sex and sexuality, and then we're going to go into the research component of this class. All right. Well, that's about it for this video. If you guys have any more questions, of course, always feel free to email me, text, or call.